Classic Doctor Who stories are, by and large, pretty straightforward. There are twists, there are cliffhangers, but most follow clear, familiar ideas: alien invasions, genocidal threats, or worlds on the brink of destruction. But by the late 1980s, Doctor Who was clinging on for survival. These well-worn story structures were starting to feel tired, predictable even. For more than 25 years on screen, keeping the show fresh was becoming an increasingly difficult task for producer John Nathan Turner and script editor Andrew Cartmel. And yet, in the show's final years, something changed. The Seventh Doctor era began to experiment, pushing Doctor Who into darker, more layered, and far more complex territory than ever before. Stories became denser, more ambitious, and sometimes far more confusing. Which raises an interesting question. Was Doctor Who cancelled just as it was starting to reinvent itself? Because out of this creative shift came one story that embodies all of it: ambition, complexity, and confusion. That story is Ghostlight, the second story of season 26 and the last ever to be filmed in the classic era. A story that even now divides fans, not just over whether it's good, but over what it's actually about. So, let's shed some light on Ghostlight and ask, is this Doctor Who's confusing masterpiece? Just to warn you, there are some spoilers coming up. Ghostlight was written by Mark Platt, who holds a rather unusual distinction in Doctor Who history. He's only one or two writers of the classic era to have a story produced for the show without being a professional television writer at the time. The other person being Andrew Smith, who wrote Full Circle back in 1980. But despite not being a professional, Platt was far from inexperienced. He'd been a fan of Doctor Who since its very beginning in 1963, and by the early 1980s had been regularly submitting story ideas to the production office, none of which, however, had made it to screen. Until now. And when his idea finally broke through, they didn't arrive at something simple. In fact, the version of Ghostlight that we end up seeing on screen is a heavily scaled down version of something far more ambitious. Platt's original concept was a story titled Lungbarrow, a dense, lore-heavy narrative set on Gallifrey centered around an ancient house and deeply tied to the Doctor's past. That, however, was exactly the problem. Producer John Nathan Turner and script editor Andrew Cartmel were actively trying to restore a sense of mystery to the Doctor, particularly in the era of the Seventh Doctor. A story that explained too much about his origins ran completely counter to that goal. So Lungbarrow was rejected, but not abandoned. Instead, many of its core ideas, an ancient house, hidden histories, and themes of evolution and identity were reworked into a new story. Along the way, it went through the titles such as The Bestiary and Life Cycle, both of which hint at the thematic core that would remain intact. Eventually, the story became known as Ghostlight. And that origin is important, because even in its reduced form, you can still feel the shape of a much larger, much complex story underneath. Ideas laid on top of ideas, some of them only partially explored, others barely explained at all, which might go some way to explaining why Ghostlight feels the way it does. As for Lungbarrow, it wouldn't disappear entirely. Mark Platt would later revisit those ideas in the New Adventures novels, finally restoring the Gallifrey setting and the deeper exploration of the Doctor's past that television never allowed. Mise En Scene is a French term meaning placing the stage or setting the scene. The idea that a story's visuals can establish its tone, themes, and expectation before a single line of dialogue is actually spoken. And in Ghostlight, those visuals are doing something very specific. They're misleading you. The story is set entirely within the Victorian mansion of Gabriel Chase in 1883, and from the very beginning, everything about it suggests a traditional Gothic ghost story. The house is dark and oppressive, its occupants behave strangely, and the TARDIS materialises in a room that looks like a cross between a laboratory and a nursery. The Doctor and Ace explore the house as if it's haunted, while they themselves are being watched by glowing eyes from toys and stuffed animals. Even the title, Ghostlight, pushes you in a very specific direction. You're being primed to expect a ghost story, and to that extent, that's what you get, but only on the surface. Because as the story unfolds, that Gothic framework quickly begins to feel like a distraction, something that gestures towards horror tropes, while quietly setting up something far more complex underneath. The first layer of that complexity comes in the form of Josiah Samuel Smith, one of the house's most prominent and unsettling occupants. At first, he appears to be little more than an eccentric Victorian gentleman, deeply fascinated by Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution. His debates with the Reverend Ernest Matthews frame him as part of a very recognisable conflict: science versus religion. It's familiar, grounded, and understandable. But it doesn't stay that way, because almost immediately something feels off. Smith is too intense, too knowing. There's something distinctly alien about him, even before the story confirms it. And that unease only grows as his intentions become clearer, particularly his plan to assassinate Queen Victoria using the invitation of the disgraced explorer Redford's Ben Cooper as a means to gain access to Buckingham Palace. And on paper, that plot sounds ridiculous. An assassination attempt on Queen Victoria in a Gothic haunted house story. It feels oddly small, almost trivial, but that's the point, because this entire narrative thread functions less as the main story and more of a kind of misdirection, a MacGuffin in the Hitchcockian sense. It gives the audience something concrete to follow, something that feels like a traditional-ish Doctor Who plot, while the real story is quietly unfolding elsewhere, beneath the surface, hidden in the details, waiting to be uncovered. Before long, Ghostlight begins to evolve, and not just in its narrative, but in what it's actually about. Because the suspicions around Josiah Samuel Smith are correct. He isn't human. He's an alien, originally known as Survey, part of an expedition led by a far more powerful being known as Light. Alongside him was another entity, Control, both tasked with cataloguing life on Earth. Light's ship lies hidden beneath Gabriel Chase, with its owner dormant as he sleeps. Control has been imprisoned, but Survey escaped. Reinventing himself as Josiah Smith, he takes control of the house and its occupants, dominating figures like Mrs. Pritchard and Gwendolyn, whilst even installing a Neanderthal, Nimrod, as his butler. Everything within Gabriel Chase becomes part of his own experiment. And this is where the story's central idea comes into focus: evolution. Because Smith doesn't just study it, he embodies it. Throughout the story, he continuously transforms, refining himself into the image of a perfect Victoria gentleman. With each change, he becomes more controlled, more powerful, even appearing to grow younger. This isn't just disguise, it's self-directed evolution, an attempt to break free from Light's rigid system and become something new, something superior. And everyone who challenges that vision becomes part of the experiment. Reverend Matthews, who opposes Smith's ideas, is forcibly reduced to a primitive state. Inspector Mackenzie, originally drawn to investigate the house, is stripped of his agency entirely, frozen and stored like an insect specimen in a drawer. Even people are no longer people. They're data, specimens, points in an evolutionary chain to be controlled. And as all of this unfolds, the true nature of the conflict begins to emerge. This is no longer a Gothic mystery, or even a simple sci-fi plot. It's a battle over evolution itself. Who controls it? Who defines it? And what happens when something refuses to stay in its place? And crucially, Smith isn't the only one manipulating events from behind the scenes, because the Doctor has been playing his own game all along. While the external conflict of Ghostlight is being played out, aliens, evolution, control, another story is unfolding beneath it, and in many ways it's the more important one, because as the Doctor begins to dismantle Josiah Samuel Smith's control over Gabriel Chase, freeing Control and ultimately awakening Light, the narrative seems to be building towards a fairly typical resolution. The villain is challenged, the threat escalates, the Doctor wins. Light himself represents the ultimate extreme, A being, an entity so obsessed with order and cataloguing that evolution becomes an inconvenience, something that needs to be stopped entirely. But even he is defeated, not through force, but through an idea. The Doctor exposes the futility of resisting change, and light disperses, unable to comprehend a universe that refuses to stand still. And yet, none of this is really the point, because all of it, Smith, light, the house, even the threat to Queen Victoria, functions as something else entirely. That distraction, the MacGuffin. The real story of Ghostlight lies once again between the relationship of Ace and the Doctor. Because their arrival at Gabriel Chase wasn't coincidence, it was intentional, planned, and engineered. From the moment they step outside the TARDIS, Ace is uncomfortable. The house feels wrong, familiar in a way she can't quite place. And as the story unfolds, that unease turns into recognition. Because Gabriel Chase is the house she burnt down in her youth. Only now, it's 100 years earlier. This isn't just another adventure. This is the Doctor forcing Ace to confront her past, her fear, her anger, and the moments that have been quietly shaping her since before she ever stepped inside the TARDIS. And she knows it. Her anger towards the Doctor is real. He brought her here without warning, without consent, and pushed her into reliving something deeply personal. For a time, their relationship fractures under the weight of it. But then comes the choice. The Doctor offers her a way out, a return to the safety of the TARDIS, a chance to walk away. And she refuses, because this is where Ace's story evolves. Not biologically like Smith, not abstractly like Control, but personally. She chooses to stay, to face what scares her, to take control of her own narrative. And in doing so, she becomes something new. Even the structure of the storyline reinforces this. The events of Gabriel Chase form a kind of closed loop, a bootstrap paradox. The Doctor and Ace's presence in the past creates the very haunting that Ace experiences in the future. Their actions awaken light, unravel Smith's control, and leave the house in the state that one day will terrify her into burning it down. Cause and effect collapse into one another. The fear creates the event creates the fear. And at the centre of all this is the Doctor, quietly manipulating events, guiding Ace through a test that she never realised she was taking. How much she knew from the beginning is left deliberately ambiguous. But what's clear is this. This isn't an accident, it's design. Because throughout the Seventh Doctor era, the Doctor just doesn't travel with his companions. He shapes them, tests them, pushes them towards something greater. And in Ghostlight, Ace passes one of these many tests. Not by defeating the villain, but by confronting herself. So when you step back and look at Ghostlight as a whole, what you actually have are three distinct stories, each layered on top of the other, each operating with a different level of depth and meaning. There's the surface level narrative, Josiah Smith's bizarre ambition to evolve into the perfect Victoria gentleman and assassinate Queen Victoria. On its own, it feels almost trivial, overtly elaborate, slightly absurd, and strangely underdeveloped. But that's intentional. It reflects an alien's misunderstanding of humanity, an attempt to imitate power without truly understanding it. Beneath that sits the broader science fiction narrative, Smith's rebellion against light, his manipulation of evolution, and his control over Gabriel Chase and its inhabitants. This feels like the main plot, the one driving the story forward. And underneath that sits the emotional core, Ace's journey. Three narratives, all interlinked, all essential, and all competing for space. Because this is where Ghostlight begins to struggle. By the late 1980s, Doctor Who had moved to shorter seasons and tighter formats. Season 26 consists of just 4 stories across 14 episodes, and Ghostlight is only given 3 of them to tell you what is, quite clearly, a much larger story. And you can feel it. The pacing is relentless. Ideas are introduced, then quickly left behind. Characters appear, transform, and disappear without barely any time to breathe. Narrative never quite slows down long enough to fully explain itself. Now, some of that is actually by design. Mark Platt has spoken about not wanting to hand the story to the audience on a plate, instead encouraging viewers to engage, to interpret it, to piece things together for themselves. And to that extent, that idea works. There is a genuine satisfaction in unpacking Ghostlight and connecting its ideas and drawing your own conclusions. But that approach relies on balance. Because if a story becomes too compressed, too dense, then instead of inviting interpretation, it risks losing clarity altogether. And that's ultimately what you're left with. A story that throws idea after idea at you in rapid succession, asking you to keep up as it moves faster and faster. Each member of the cast struggled to fully grasp the script, including experienced actors like Sylvia Sims. Mark Platt himself once described it as the Addams Family on acid, which feels surprisingly accurate, because you can see the ambition, you can see the depth, you can see the ideas trying to break through. But within the constraints of a 3-episode structure, everything is compressed, each narrative essential, but none quite given enough room to fully breathe. And it's that tight squeeze that defines Ghostlight. Not a lack of ideas, but too many of them, all at once. And this goes a long way to explaining why, on first viewing, so many people are left asking the same questions. What on earth is going on? So going back to the original question, is Ghostlight Doctor Who's confusing masterpiece? For me, the answer is yes, because what you have here is one of the most ambitious stories of the Seventh Doctor era. One that attempts to juggle multiple narratives, layered themes, and an ongoing character arc all within a single story. And remarkably, a lot of it works. It's a story I find myself coming back to again and again, not just because I enjoy it, but because each time there's something new to uncover, a detail I missed, a connection I hadn't quite made, and that process of gradually understanding it is actually part of its appeal. In that sense, Ghostlight almost rewards effort. It demands that you engage with it, and when you do, it gives you something back. It also sits as a natural companion piece to The Curse of Fenric, another story that pushes Ace to confront her past, challenging her fears, and explores the Doctor's more manipulative, strategic nature. Both stories deal with control, both play with time and paradox, and both place Ace at the centre of something much larger than herself. The Curse of Fenric has 4 episodes to develop its ideas. Ghostlight had just 3. And you can feel that constraint, because for all its ambition, Ghostlight is undeniably compressed. Ideas come quickly, sometimes far too quickly. Characters and concepts are introduced and move on before the time they've had to fully breathe. And that lack of space is ultimately what prevents it from being universally understood on a first viewing. But here's the interesting thing. That compression is also what makes it memorable, because while it may leave you confused, it also leaves you curious. It makes you want to go back, to re-watch, to piece it all together again. And in doing so, the very thing that feels like a flaw becomes part of its identity. So yes, Ghostlight can be confusing, especially if viewed in isolation or without the wider context of Ace's story arc in episodes like Remembrance of the Daleks and Greatest Show in the Galaxy. But it's also layered, ambitious, and unlike almost anything else Doctor Who had done up to that point. A story that doesn't just ask you to watch it, but to work for it. And for me, that's exactly what makes it a masterpiece. But that's just my take. Is Ghostlight a confusing mess? Or one of Doctor Who's most ambitious and rewarding stories? Let me know in the comments below. But for now, it's the end. But the moment has been prepared for.